I'd like to begin with a recent teaching by Joan Halifax, the abbot of the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, followed by a poem called The Acupuncture Needle of Zazen by the Chinese Zen master Hongzhi. Zazen is not meditation. It is not a mental exercise, a thing you do with your mind. It is not focused on practices that are antidotes to afflictive states or secondary consciousness. It is not about attaining a special state, being relaxed, or solving your problems. It is not about reducing stress, working with trauma, and being happy, nor is it associated with visualizations or phrases to nurture certain qualities of mind. It is about being radically open to things just as they are, not grasping at or rejecting phenomena, but simply being present and at ease with moment-to-moment uncertainty and groundlessness. It is fully embodied presence, with no separation between the mind, heart, body, and the context of our lived experience, and letting openness or not knowing deconstruct our version of reality. It is the method of non-method. Nothing extra, nothing added. This is Zazen, just sitting upright. The acupuncture needle of Zazen. The essential function of all Buddhas, the functional essence of all ancestors, is to know without touching things and to illuminate without encountering objects. Knowing without touching things, this knowledge is innately subtle. Illuminating without encountering objects, this illumination is innately miraculous. The knowledge, innately subtle, has never engaged in discriminative thinking. The illumination, innately miraculous, has never displayed the slightest identification. Never engaging in discriminating thinking, this knowledge is rare without match. Never displaying the most minute identification, this illumination is complete without grasping. The water is clear right down to the bottom. Fish lazily swim on. The sky is vast without end. Birds fly far into the distance. The topic of this talk is cultivating the empty field, the silent illumination of Zen Buddhist master Hongzhi, which is the title of this book by Taigen Dan Leighton, the abbot of ancient Dragon Zen Gate Temple in Chicago, and like our abbot Galen Roshi, a Dharma heir of Tenshin Roshi Reb Anderson. The book was my assigned reading when Galen Roshi formally invited me to become a lay entrusted teacher in the Soto Zen tradition at the Houston Zen Center. So this is sort of an advanced placement Dharma school book report. And I will be sharing a few poems from the book to illustrate the quality of Hongzhi's thinking and writing. Hongzhi, it is spelled Hongzhi, but pronounced Hongzer, was a 12th century Chinese Chan teacher and poet who was a precursor and an inspiration to Dogen, who lived 100 years later and is considered the founder of the Japanese Soto school of Zen. Hongzhi was the first Zen teacher to fully articulate the practice of silent illumination, which Dogen called shikantaza, and which is commonly referred to by Zen students today as just sitting. Like Dogen, Hongzhi's teachings are both spiritual literature and meditation teaching, and his practice instructions are perhaps best read like poetry rather than expository prose. However, at least for me, thanks to Taigen's translations, well-organized introduction, and extensive notes, it is easier to follow than Dogen. Hongzhi Zhengwei was born in 1091 in Shanxi province to a family named Li. Hongzhi, which translates as vast wisdom, was a posthumous name bestowed upon him by the emperor. Zheng Wei, his monk ordination name, translates as true awakening. In Japanese, Hongzhi is known as Wanshi Shogaku. His father was a lay disciple in the Chinese Linji or Rinzai school. At the age of 11, Hongzhi left home to become a monk. At 18, he studied with a Soto Zen teacher who taught him to sit still as a block of wood, a practice he maintained throughout his life. Such cross-legged sitting is the physical context for all of Hongzhi's meditation instructions and the fundamental practice of the Soto tradition. At least until, like me, you get too broken down to do it all the time and migrate into a chair when necessary. As a young man, Hongzhi lived in various temples, including one where the teacher was Yan Wu, whose collection of 100 teaching stories, the Blue Cliff Record, remains one of the most frequently used sources of koans for Zen study. Hongzhi later compiled his own koan collection, the Book of Serenity. In 1129, when he was 38, Hongzhi accepted an invitation to teach at the Bright Virtue Monastery on Mount Ti-on Tong. At the time he arrived, the monastery was small and in disrepair. Under Hongzhi's guidance, it grew to accommodate 1,200 monks. In 1157, he journeyed down the mountain for the first time in nearly 30 years to pay his respects to local officials and patrons of his temple. When he returned to the temple, he gave a farewell talk to the monks and wrote a letter to his friend and sometime critic, Dawei Zonggao, asking him to take charge of the temple. He then wrote his last poem and passed away sitting in formal meditation position. The poem reads, "Illusory dreams, phantom flowers, 67 years. A white bird vanishes in the mist. Autumn waters merge with the sky." Hongzhi had 8 immediate successors, but none of them are in the direct line of ancestors that leads to Dogen. Our Soto Zen lineage chart from China to Japan looks like this. Here's Wei Neng, the 6th ancestor, up at the top of the page. If you go down the list here, here is Shi Tao, who wrote Harmony of Difference and Equality, the poem that we chant regularly. Here's Dong Shan, who wrote Song of the Jeweled Mir Samadhi. And turning the page over here, moving through the centuries, here is Fu Shan, who was a Rinzai teacher who actually rescued the Soto tradition when it was about to die out. He stepped in and took over. And then down here is Hongzhi. If you go down through here, but it's this side of it that goes on down to Dogen. However, Dogen revered Hongzhi, referring to him as an ancient Buddha. In his practice instructions, Hongzhi urged practitioners to, quote, take the backward step and directly reach the middle of the circle where the light issues forth. Turning the light inward to illuminate oneself is, in Dogen's words, the essential art of Zazen. Taigen quotes Dogen in saying that its fulfillment occurs, quote, when body and mind of themselves drop away and the original face is manifested. Here is an excerpt from Hongzhi's poem, Hongzhi's poem, "With total trust, roam and play in samadhi. Enjoy empty and desireless, cold and thin, simple and genuine. This is how to strike down and fold up the remaining habits of many lives. When the stains from old habits are exhausted, the original light appears, blazing through your skull, not admitting any other matters. vast and spacious, like sky and water merging during autumn, like snow and moon having the same color. This field is without boundary, beyond direction, magnificently one entity without edge or seam. Further, when you turn within and drop off everything completely, realization occurs. So this is the essence of Zen, the tradition in which I have practiced for nearly 30 years and in which I am about to become an entrusted lay teacher. Yet I have to admit, when I first tried to read this book, I resisted it. I was not in the right headspace. Given all the dark things going on in the world, it seemed like a retreat into an idealized state of bliss. Here is an excerpt from one of the practice instructions called Naga Meditation. This is the time and place to leap beyond the 10,000 emotional entanglements of innumerable kalpas. One contemplation of 10,000 years finally goes beyond all the transitory, and you emerge with spontaneity. The clouds traveling in the vacant valley are free, whether moving or tranquil. Agreeably enter every sense dust while constantly staying in samadhi. Therefore, we have been told that nagas are always in meditation, never apart from this sublime state. I thought this might work for the nagas, who were half human, half serpent beings who lived underwater in Indian mythology. But I don't know anybody that is always in samadhi, never apart from this sublime state. So I felt somewhat vindicated when Galen Roshi told me that this had been a complaint about Hongzhi in his own time, that his teaching led to excessive quietism, though she added that the criticism was not justified. The criticism originated with Dawei Zhongyao, a Rinzai teacher who was a colleague and friend of Hongzhi and an adherent of the teaching of sudden enlightenment through the use of koans. But while their emphases may have differed, Dawei also practiced sitting meditation, and Hongzhi also worked with koans. And when Hongzhi knew he was dying, he asked Dawei to manage the affairs of his monastery. My breakthrough finally arrived when I was reading the poem Guidepost of Silent Illumination, kind of one of the centerpieces of this book, for the third or fourth time. I came to the lines, drink the medicine of good views, beat the poison-smeared drum. When they interact, killing and giving life are up to you. Through the gate, the self emerges, and the branches bear fruit. Only silence is the supreme speech, only illumination, the universal response. Unlike the earlier lines of the poem, and many of his other poems, this is a command to action. And the tone is a bit different from the wonder that exists in serenity. Killing is up to you. What does that mean? So I did a bit of research. The medicine of good views refers to the Dharma. The poison-smeared drum refers to Indian mythology, where a drum smeared with poison can kill enemies who hear it from a great distance. In this case, the enemy is delusion. Killing and giving life refers to the use of skillful means, which can sometimes lead to conflict, but which is intended to reduce suffering in the long term. Hongzhi, to me, seems to be saying that we should not be afraid to take action to oppose the external forces of greed, hate, and delusion, while simultaneously practicing silent illumination in order to free ourselves of delusion. Later in the poem, he writes, if illumination neglects serenity, then aggressiveness appears. Dialoguing and certifying, they respond to each other appropriately. But if serenity neglects illumination, Murkiness leads to wasted Dharma. When silent illumination is fulfilled, the lotus blossoms, the dreamer awakens. The lotus blossoms, the dreamer awakens. According to Taigen, the interdependence of the absolute and relative is at the core of Hongzhi's teaching, and he continuously is seeking ways to address this apparent dichotomy. Taigen writes, quote, "For Hongzhi, the whole purpose of practice is to graciously share yourself with the 100 grass tips, by which he means the myriad beings in the marketplace." Taigen continues, Hongzhi frequently exhorts his listeners to study and enact the teaching more thoroughly and penetratingly, and to persist in going beyond their current realization. Again and again, he urges us to actualize the state of total awareness. On page after page, Hongzhi's practice instructions for his monks, many of them presumably advanced meditators, point us in this direction, and his religious verses stand alongside Dogen as supremely poetic expressions of Zen understanding. The book also includes the familiar translations of the 3 teaching poems that are at the philosophical foundation of our Soto tradition: Song of the Grass Roof Hermitage, Harmony of Difference and Equality, and Song of the Precious Mere Samadhi, which are chanted regularly in Zen centers all over the world, including this one. This is a wise and beautiful book, and I am thankful to Galen Roshi for assigning it to me to read. But it is still difficult for me to fully embrace Hongzhi's faith that when silent illumination is fulfilled, the lotus will blossom, and the dreamer, meaning you and me, will awaken. At this profoundly troubling juncture in our nation's and our world's history, I find myself identifying with the wandering exile in Tu Fu's 8th century poem, A Night in Camp, written in the midst of a horrible civil war that ended the golden age of China's Tang dynasty. In the penetrating damp, I sleep under the bamboos. Under the penetrating moonlight, in the wilderness, the thick dew turns to fine mist. One by one, the stars go out. Only the fireflies are left. Birds cry over the water. War breeds its consequences. It is useless to worry. Wakeful while the long night goes. The good Taoist that he is, Tu Fu knows that it's useless to worry, yet he still can't sleep as the long night goes on. Maybe you know this feeling. It is probably instructive for us to remember that this teaching, this practice, this faith, and yes, Zen practice is a faith, is an act of faith, has endured through countless atrocities, wars, and genocides in Asia over the last 2.5 millennia, and the central promise of liberating all beings from suffering remains intact. At the airport in Portland on my way to Houston, I picked up this book by Thich Nhat Hanh to read on the plane because I thought it might cheer me up. I also bought the New York Times, which I decided not to read. The book is called No Mud, No Lotus. Early in my practice, I read several of Thich Nhat Hanh's books, and they contributed greatly to the transformation in my life that occurred when I began to practice Zen more deeply. But it had been a while since I'd experienced Thai's gentle, simple way of communicating the Dharma. Reading this book was like reuniting with an old friend and returning to the roots of our Sangha. The premise of the book is that suffering and happiness are not separate, and that the art of happiness is the art of suffering well. Thich Nhat Hanh saw plenty of mud in his life. During the Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II, when up to an estimated 1 to 2 million Vietnamese starved to death. During the struggle against the French colonialists after the war, and subsequent American military operation, as it was euphemistically called, in which he emerged as a leading activist for peace, opposed by both sides, and consequently was exiled from the land of his birth until near the end of his life. Yet he writes, "When I lived in Vietnam during the war, it was difficult to see our way through that dark and heavy mud. It seemed like the destruction would just go on and on forever. Every day people would ask me if I thought the war would end soon. It was very difficult to answer because there was no end in sight. But I knew if I said, I don't know, that would only water their seeds of despair. So when people asked me that question, I replied, everything is impermanent, even war. It will end someday." Knowing that, we could continue to work for peace. And indeed, the war did end. Now the former mortal enemies are busily trading and touring back and forth, and people throughout the world enjoy practicing our tradition's teaching on mindfulness and peace. If you know how to make good use of the mud, you can grow beautiful lotuses. If you know how to make good use of suffering, you can produce happiness. We do need some suffering to make happiness possible. And most of us have enough suffering inside and around us to be able to do that. We don't need to create more. No mud, no lotus. A simple saying to help us shine a light through dark times. Thank you, Thich Nhat Hanh. I'd like to conclude with a few more lines from Hong Zhi's poem, Guidepost for Silent Illumination. Silent and serene, forgetting words, bright clarity appears before you. When you reflect it, you become vast. When you enact it, you are spiritually uplifted. Spiritually solitary and shining, inner illumination restores wonder. Dew in the moonlight, a river of stars, snow-covered pines, clouds enveloping the peak. In darkness, it is most bright, while hidden, all the more manifest. The crane dreams in the wintry mists. The autumn waters flow far in the distance. Endless kalpas are totally empty. All things completely the same.